Sir, it'll take at least an hour. This isn't a neighborhood we usually stop in. The driver kept his hands on the steering wheel, eyes forward, as if looking too closely at the cracked buildings outside might invite trouble. An hour. The man in the back seat exhaled slowly. An hour for a tow truck, he said, calm but clipped. Or an hour before something else goes wrong. The driver hesitated. I'm just saying, we should stay in the car. And do what? The man asked. Pretend the world ends at tinted glass? Silence filled the cabin. The engine was dead. The air conditioning had already begun to weaken. Outside, the street hummed with a low, restless energy voices, distant traffic, the metallic rattle of something loose in the wind. The man opened the door. Sir, the driver started. I'll be right outside, he said. Call again. Tell them who I am. That usually worked. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the door closing behind him with a soft, expensive thud that felt almost insulting in this place. The heat pressed in immediately, carrying the smell of sun-baked concrete and old cooking oil. The buildings around him were worn down but stubbornly standing, their brick faces scarred by time and neglect. This was not the America featured in investor decks or keynote presentations. This was the America people edited out. A few residents glanced his way. No one approached. No one smiled. They simply watched, the way people did when something unfamiliar wandered into their field of vision. He adjusted his jacket, then stopped himself. The gesture felt pointless. Appearances had no currency here. An hour, he reminded himself. Just an hour. He leaned against the car at first, scrolling through emails out of reflex. But the signal was weak, the screen slow to respond. Irritation crept in, sharp and unwelcome. His entire adult life had been engineered around efficiency. Delays were variables to be eliminated, not endured. A faint clicking sound cut through his thoughts. Click. Pause. Click, click. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, intentional. He looked up. A few yards away, near the side of a low apartment building, a child sat on the ground in the narrow strip of shade cast by a fire escape. She couldn't have been more than 6. Small frame, dark skin, barely noticeable at first glance, exactly the kind of presence the world learned to overlook early. Around her lay a scatter of electronic scraps, a dented metal case, wires stripped at the ends, a keyboard missing keys, screws arranged with surprising care. She held a screwdriver too big for her hand, turning it slowly, methodically. She wasn't playing. That was the first thing that struck him. Children usually moved with excess, too much energy, too much noise. This girl moved like someone conserving effort. Every motion deliberate. Her face was serious, focused, as if the world beyond the small square of concrete she occupied simply didn't exist. He took a step closer without meaning to. From behind him, the driver's voice carried, low and tense. Sir, I really think I'm fine, the man said, not turning around. The girl shifted a wire, then tapped the side of a small monitor propped against a crate. The screen flickered, went dark, then blinked back on. She frowned, not in frustration, but thought. She adjusted something inside the open casing and tried again. The screen stayed on this time. The man felt a flicker of interest, unexpected and sharp. What are you building? He asked. The girl didn't answer immediately. She finished tightening the screw, set the screwdriver down, and only then looked up at him. Her eyes were clear, observant, unafraid. Fixing it, she said. He almost smiled. Fixing what? A computer, she replied, as if the answer were obvious. He glanced at the pile of parts. Those are old. They still work, she said. Most of them. Most isn't all, he said before he could stop himself. She shrugged. You only need the parts that matter. The words landed heavier than they should have. He crouched slightly, careful not to invade her space. Does it turn on? Yes, she said. Sometimes. To waste. Sometimes? The power supply's uneven, she explained. If I don't balance the load, it shuts off. He stared at her. Balance the load. He had used that exact phrase in a meeting with his senior engineers 3 days ago. How do you know that? He asked. She tilted her head, studying him now. Because it keeps doing it. That's not really an answer. It is, she said, turning back to the machine. You just don't like it. A laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Short, surprised. He hadn't laughed like that in a while. Behind him, the driver cleared his throat. "Sir, people are staring. They're allowed," the man said quietly. He watched as the girl Annie, he would later learn, though she hadn't told him yet, rerouted a cable, her fingers moving with instinctive certainty. No hesitation, no trial and error, just decision after decision, each one building on the last. "You go to school?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "When it's open." "Os. When it's open," he repeated. She nodded. "When there's a teacher," the answer settled uncomfortably in his chest. The monitor flickered again, then stabilized. Lines of text appeared crude, monochrome, but unmistakably code. Not random symbols, not nonsense. Structured, intentional. "What's that?" he asked. "My test," she said. "It tells me if it's thinking right." Thinking right. He straightened slowly, the weight of the moment pressing in on him. In the distance, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere, a door slammed. Life continued, indifferent. The driver's phone rang behind him. "Sir," the driver called. "They say another 40 minutes. The man didn't answer. He was watching a 6-year-old girl, sitting on broken concrete. Coax intelligence out of things the world had thrown away. For the first time that day, maybe for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about time. He was thinking about value, and about how easily a system could miss something extraordinary simply because it had learned where not to look. The man stayed where he was long after the driver stopped talking. Around him, the neighborhood continued at its own unhurried pace. A woman pushed a stroller past the corner, humming softly. 2 older men argued over a card game at a folding table near the building entrance, their voices rising and falling like a familiar song. Somewhere above, a radio played an old soul track, distorted but recognizable. Life here did not pause for broken cars or strangers in tailored jackets. He realized, with a faint discomfort, how rarely he had seen life up close like this. In his world, neighborhoods were abstractions, demographics in slide decks, heat maps in quarterly reports. Words like underserved and underdeveloped floated across polished conference tables, stripped of texture and smell and sound. They were problems to be solved from a distance. This place refused distance. Annie leaned closer to her makeshift machine, the glow of the monitor reflecting faintly on her face. The code scrolled slowly, line by line, primitive by industry standards, but purposeful. There was a logic to it he recognized immediately, the kind that didn't come from tutorials or formal instruction. It came from curiosity sharpened by necessity. "You taught yourself," he said, more a statement than a question. She nodded without looking up. "I watch. I try. If it breaks, I fix it again. Hope, where do you get the parts?" "Behind the stores. Sometimes people leave them near the trash." She paused, then added, "They throw away good things." The simplicity of the sentence unsettled him. Good things. He followed her gaze to the pile beside her discarded hardware, obsolete by corporate timelines, useless in boardrooms obsessed with the next upgrade cycle. In his company alone, thousands of machines were decommissioned every year, written off as losses, their potential unaccounted for once they fell off the balance sheet. And here sat a child, rebuilding value from what others had dismissed. "Do your parents know you're doing this?" he asked carefully. Annie shrugged. "My mom works. She says if I'm here, she knows where I am." He nodded. It was an answer shaped by reality, not neglect. Trust, born of limited choices. The driver shifted behind him, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir," he said quietly. "Roadside just texted. They're stuck on the freeway." The man didn't turn around. "How long?" "Could be another 40 minutes, maybe more, an hour and a half." Then, in any other situation, the delay would have irritated him beyond measure. Time was his most guarded asset. He protected it ruthlessly, outsourcing inconvenience, compressing minutes until his days felt like efficient transactions rather than lived experiences. Yet now, standing on uneven concrete, watching a 6-year-old debug a power fluctuation problem that would have stumped some junior engineers, he felt something unfamiliar. "Patience. What happens when it works?" he asked. Annie glanced up again, her eyes narrowing slightly. as if she hadn't considered the question in those terms. Then I see what else it can do. That's it, she nodded. That's enough. He smiled this time, slow and thoughtful. Do you know what people usually do when they make something like this? He asked. They sell it? Sometimes, he said. More often, they ask for permission first. Annie frowned. Why? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were a dozen answers he could give: regulations, credentials, liability, corporate structures, but none of them felt honest enough to offer a child. They think someone else gets to decide if it's allowed, he said finally. She considered that, then shook her head. That doesn't make sense. No, he thought. It doesn't. A sudden flicker crossed the screen. Annie tapped a key, waited, then tapped another. The code adjusted itself, stabilizing. There, she said. That's better. Rebaz it. He leaned closer, unable to stop himself now. What did you change? The order, she replied. It was trying to do too much at once. He felt a quiet jolt. Not surprise this time, but recognition. The principle was foundational prioritization, sequencing, load management. Concepts his company spent millions teaching adults who struggled to internalize them, and she had arrived at it alone. Annie, he said, tasting her name for the first time. Do you know what a lab is? Her eyes lit up, just a little. Like where scientists work? Yes. Places with equipment, space, resources. She looked back at her computer, then at the pile of parts around her. That would be easier. Easier. He straightened slowly, his mind already moving, connecting dots he hadn't intended to draw. Images rose unbidden. A white room filled with light, rows of machines humming quietly, doors that required badges and codes. A world designed for people like him. A world Annie would never be invited into, unless someone broke the pattern. From behind them, one of the men at the card table called out, Hey, kid, you fixin' that thing again? Annie nodded without looking. Almost. The man laughed. She's always fixin' something, he said to the stranger. Smarter than all of us. There was pride in his voice. Not exaggeration. Pride. The man felt the weight of it settle on him. This community knew Annie, valued her in ways the outside world never would. Yet that same world held the keys to opportunities she didn't even know to ask for. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from his assistant, followed by another from a board member. Questions, expectations, the invisible pull of his real life reasserting itself. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, Would you show me how you test it? Annie hesitated, just for a moment. Then she scooted over, making room beside her on the concrete. The invitation was silent, but unmistakable. He lowered himself carefully, ignoring the stiffness in his suit, the grit against his palms. Up close, the screen buzzed softly, the letters slightly blurred but readable. He watched her run the test again, her finger hovering over the key before pressing it with quiet confidence. The result appeared. Clean, efficient. Behind them, the driver stared, speechless. The man felt something settle into place inside him, a shift as subtle and irreversible as a fault line giving way. This was no longer curiosity. This was responsibility. If this moment made you pause and feel something real, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your voice matters here, so join our community and subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they end. He looked at Annie, then at the street, at the buildings, at the life unfolding beyond the narrow margins of his usual vision. Somewhere in the distance, a tow truck's horn blared. The sound felt suddenly irrelevant. The tow truck arrived without ceremony. No flashing lights, no sense of rescue, just a dented white vehicle easing to the curb as if it had always planned to be late. The driver stepped out, glanced at the luxury sedan, then at the man sitting on the concrete beside a little girl surrounded by electronic scraps. He hesitated, clearly reassessing his assumptions. You the owner? The tow driver asked. The man stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands. Yes. We can have you back on the road in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. The words landed differently than they would have an hour ago. He nodded, but his attention drifted back to Annie, who was still watching her screen, unfazed by the arrival of help or the subtle shift in energy around them. "I'll be right back," he said to her. She nodded, already returning to her work. He walked to the car, speaking briefly with the tow driver, authorizing the repair. The driver of the sedan hovered nearby, relief written plainly on his face. "Sir," the driver said under his breath, "we should head straight to the office once this is done. They've been asking." "I know," the man replied. "Give me a few minutes." The driver blinked. "A few minutes?" "Yes." It was not a request. As the tow driver began his work, the man stepped aside, pulling his phone from his pocket at last. Messages stacked the screen, missed calls, urgent texts, reminders blinking red. He ignored them all and opened a blank note instead. For a moment, his fingers hovered, uncertain. This wasn't how decisions like this were made. Not without consultation, projections, legal review, not without at least 3 meetings and a risk assessment. Yet some truths, he was learning, arrived fully formed. He typed a single sentence, then another. Names followed, numbers, a location. When he finished, he locked the phone and walked back toward Annie. "Do you like questions?" he asked. She looked up. "Depends," he smiled. "Fair enough. May I ask you one more?" She considered him, then nodded. "If you had access to anything you needed," he said carefully, "what would you build first?" She didn't answer right away. This time, the pause was different, longer, heavier. She stared at her machine as if imagining it transformed, multiplied, freed from its limitations. "Something that doesn't break," she said finally. "Something that keeps going even when parts fail." He felt a quiet chill. "Why that?" "Because things always fail," she said simply. "People leave. Power goes out. Stuff gets old. If it stops every time that happens, what's the point?" He exhaled slowly. There it was again, that clarity adults spent decades unlearning. "What if I told you," he said, choosing his words with care, "that there are places where people work on problems like that all day?" Her eyes flickered with interest, cautious but undeniable. "Like school?" "Not exactly," he said. "More like a place where questions are allowed." She tilted her head. "Do you have to be big?" He paused. The honest answer was yes. Or at least, that was how the system was designed. "No," he said instead. "You have to be curious. With now there's and then." She thought about that, then nodded once, as if filing the information away for later. Behind them, the tow driver closed the hood of the sedan. "You're good to go," he called. "Shouldn't have any more trouble today." "One." The man thanked him, then turned back to Annie. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, thick, minimalist, his name embossed in understated lettering. It felt absurdly formal in his hand. He hesitated, then set it down beside her pile of parts. "That's my name," he said. "And how to reach me." She stared at the card as if it were a foreign object. "I don't have a phone," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's okay. Someone around here does." She picked it up carefully, reading the letters slowly, her brow furrowed. "You're important." The statement was neither admiration nor accusation, just observation. Listen to," he said after a moment. "Sometimes." She nodded, accepting that distinction. "Will you come back?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. It wasn't hopeful. It wasn't pleading. It was practical, as if she were asking whether to save her work or shut the system down. "Yes," he said, "I will." She studied his face, weighing the answer, then returned to her computer. "That's good," she said. "There's more to fix." He smiled, a feeling tight in his chest. As he walked back to the car, the driver opened the door for him, then leaned in slightly. "Sir," he said quietly, "with all due respect, what just happened back there?" The man looked out the window one last time. Annie sat exactly where he'd left her, already absorbed again, the card tucked carefully beneath a loose screw so it wouldn't blow away. "I think," he said slowly, "I just saw a problem we've been ignoring." The driver frowned. "A problem, sir?" "A solution," he corrected. The car pulled away from the curb, the neighborhood receding into the side mirror. As they turned the corner, the man felt the familiar pull of his old life reassert itself, the meetings, the expectations, the machinery of influence and control. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, the question wasn't whether the system would allow what he was about to do. It was whether he would allow himself not to. The city changed as the car moved. Glass replaced brick. Broken sidewalks gave way to polished stone. The air seemed cleaner, quieter, as if noise itself had been regulated. By the time the sedan slipped into the underground garage beneath the company's headquarters, the neighborhood where Annie sat surrounded by scraps already felt unreal, like a memory his mind might try to edit out later. He didn't let it. The elevator ride up was silent. His reflection stared back at him from mirrored walls. Tailored suit, controlled posture. A man who looked exactly like someone the world listened to. Yet beneath the surface, his thoughts refused to settle into their usual disciplined order. There's more to fix. The words echoed, simple and unassuming, carrying a weight he hadn't expected. He'd built his career solving problems defined by scale, millions of users, billions of dollars. Systems so complex no single person could see their entirety. But Annie's problem had been smaller, more dangerous. Visibility. The doors opened onto the executive floor. Conversations hushed as he stepped out. Assistants straightened. Phones went quiet. Someone handed him a tablet without a word. The agenda already loaded. Board's waiting, his chief of staff said, falling into step beside him. They're not happy about the delay. He nodded. When are they ever? She smiled politely, then lowered her voice. They heard about the breakdown. Of course they did. Security flagged it. Location triggered an alert. That caught his attention. An alert? She hesitated. Protocol. Certain areas automatically. I know the protocol, he said, sharper than intended. He stopped walking. Did anyone send anyone? No, she said quickly. Just monitoring. Monitoring. A clean word for surveillance, for distance enforced by policy rather than conscience. He resumed walking. The boardroom doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, sealing out the rest of the floor. 12 people sat around the table, most older than him, all powerful in ways that rarely overlapped with morality. Screens lit the walls, displaying charts, projections, the comforting geometry of numbers that obeyed rules. Let's begin, one of them said, glancing pointedly at the clock. He took his seat, listening as reports flowed past him: quarterly growth, market expansion, a brief discussion about workforce optimization that avoided the word layoffs with practiced elegance. He responded when expected, nodded when required, his mind performing its role flawlessly. Yet part of him remained on that cracked sidewalk. When the meeting ended, the others filed out in clusters, already shifting to their next priorities. He lingered, staring at the darkened screens. Everything okay? Asked Martin, one of the senior board members, pausing beside him. Yes, he said automatically. Martin studied him for a moment. You seem distracted. Just thinking. Martin smiled thinly. Careful. Thinking has a way of complicating things. The words followed him out of the room. Back in his office, he closed the door and finally allowed the silence to settle. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, distant and abstract. He loosened his tie, then removed it entirely, something he rarely did before evening. He pulled out his phone and reopened the note he'd started earlier. The sentences stared back at him, tentative but insistent. He added more now: questions, possibilities, risks, names of people he trusted and others he didn't. At the top of the page, he typed a heading, then paused. After a moment, he deleted it and typed a different one. Pilot. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Yes. The door opened and his chief of staff stepped in, carrying a folder. PR flagged something, she said carefully. There's chatter online. Someone posted a photo. A photo of what? She handed him the tablet. The image was grainy, taken from across the street. His car, the tow truck, and, unmistakably, him crouched beside a small girl on the sidewalk. The caption read, Tech CEO breaks down in the wrong neighborhood. His jaw tightened. It's not viral, she said quickly. Yet, but it could be. He handed the tablet back. Let it be. She blinked. Sir? Let it be, he repeated. No statement, no spin. That's Unusual. So is the truth, he said. We'll talk later. She hesitated, then nodded and left. Alone again, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what the system would do next. The questions it would ask, the resistance it would generate. He knew the playbook as well as anyone. Too young, too risky. Liability. Optics. He opened his eyes. None of it mattered if he did nothing. He stood, crossed the office, and pressed a button on the wall panel. "Get me legal," he said. "And research." Separately, a pause. "Any particular reason?" "Yes," he said. "I want to ask them a question they're not going to like." As the calls were set up, he returned to the window. Somewhere across the city, Annie was probably still sitting in the shade, adjusting wires, coaxing order out of chaos. No one was filming her now. No alerts were being triggered, and that, he realized, was the problem. He wasn't sure yet how he would change it, only that he would, because once you saw something the system had taught itself to ignore, looking away was no longer an option. The legal call came first. He let it ring twice before answering, watching the city below as if the answer might be written somewhere between the moving cars and the distant river. "Go ahead," he said. The voice on the other end was careful, already defensive. "We reviewed your request. Hypothetically speaking, any formal association with a minor, especially one without documented credentials, creates significant exposure." "Exposure to what?" he asked. "Liability, reputational risk, regulatory scrutiny, child labor concerns, optics." Optics again. "I'm not asking about hypotheticals," he said evenly. "I'm asking what the system would say if I tried to create space for someone who doesn't fit its template." A pause, papers shifting, someone else whispering in the background. "It would say no," Legal replied. Politely, firmly, and repeatedly. He nodded, though they couldn't see it. "Thank you." He ended the call before they could add a disclaimer. Research was next. This time, he stayed seated, fingers steepled, listening as the head of advanced development walked him through current initiatives, AI optimization, energy efficiency, scalable resilience models. All impressive, all safe. "What if," he interrupted, "you encountered a solution that didn't come through any of our pipelines?" Another pause, longer this time. "You mean external innovation?" "I mean something we missed," he said. "Something small, local, uncredentialed. ADS, that's unlikely," research said carefully. "Our models are designed to capture." "I know what they're designed to do," he cut in. "I built some of them. Humor me." Silence stretched. "Then," research said at last, "we'd have to ask why it wasn't already visible." "Exactly." He thanked them and ended the call, leaning back in his chair as the room settled around him. Two conversations, two confirmations of the same truth. The system did not fail by accident. It failed by design. That night, he didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove, not back to the neighborhood that would come later, but through parts of the city he rarely visited without an agenda. He passed closed factories, converted into luxury lofts, old schools with new banners promising opportunity, murals painted over the scars of buildings that had once been written off entirely. Progress, packaged and sold. At a red light, his phone buzzed. A message from his chief of staff. "PR wants guidance." Photos spreading. He typed back 2 words. No comment. The light turned green. By the time he reached home, it was late. The house was quiet, immaculate in the way only spaces untouched by children ever were. He poured himself a glass of water and stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing. Annie's words surfaced again. "If it stops every time things fail, what's the point?" He slept poorly, his dreams fragmented, screens flickering on and off, cables being connected and disconnected. A small figure sitting patiently amid chaos while adults argued in circles around her. In the morning, he woke with clarity. The next step wouldn't be public. It couldn't be. The system would crush anything it could see too clearly. What he needed was time, distance, quiet. A pilot. He made a call before breakfast. "Find me a space," he said. "Small. Private. No branding. Somewhere we can build without being watched." "Build what?" came the reply. A question, he said, and maybe an answer. 2 days later, he went back. This time, he didn't bring the car. He parked several blocks away and walked. The neighborhood looked different on foot, slower, more detailed. He noticed things he'd missed before: a community garden fenced in with mismatched wood, a barber shop with a hand-painted sign, chalk drawings fading on the sidewalk. Annie sat in the same place, not because she had nowhere else to go, he realized, but because this was where her work made sense, where light fell just right, where power when it worked was accessible. She looked up when she saw him, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something more thoughtful. You came back, she said. I said I would. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay. No excitement. No disbelief. Just acceptance. He crouched again, this time without hesitation. I brought something, he said, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a small device, nothing flashy, nothing new. An older model tablet, wiped clean, its casing scuffed enough not to intimidate. Her eyes widened despite herself. For me? She asked. For your work, he corrected. She took it carefully, as if it might disappear if she moved too fast. Her fingers traced the edges, already imagining its possibilities. This helps, she said softly. I know, he replied. They sat together in silence for a while, Annie exploring the device, him observing, not directing, not teaching, just watching. After a few minutes, she looked up. Why are you doing this? The question was direct, unprotected. He considered the easy answers. Charity, curiosity, inspiration. None of them were true enough. Because I think the world made a mistake, he said. And I have some responsibility for that. She frowned. Did you break it? He smiled faintly. Not by myself. She seemed to accept that. As he stood to leave, she spoke again. Will there be more? Yes, he said. If you want. She nodded. I do. Walking away, he felt the weight of what he'd begun settle fully onto his shoulders. This was no longer an idea. No longer a moment. It was a path. And once chosen, paths had a way of demanding everything. The space was smaller than he expected. No glass walls, no logos, no polished steel or glowing panels. Just an old brick warehouse tucked between a closed printing shop and a loading dock that hadn't been used in years. The windows were tall but dusty, the concrete floor scarred with old paint marks, the air faintly smelling of oil and time. Perfect. He stood near the entrance while a facilities manager explained what could be fixed and what should be left alone. Electricity was stable enough. Internet would take a few days. The rest, tables, chairs, equipment, could be brought in quietly. No signage? The manager asked. None, he replied. And no press. The man raised an eyebrow but nodded. Money smoothed confusion. By the end of the week, the space was ready. Not impressive, not inspiring to the wrong people, just functional, honest. He returned to the neighborhood on a Saturday morning. This time, Annie wasn't alone. A woman stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes sharp with the kind of caution learned through years of disappointment. She watched him approach without smiling, her body positioned subtly between him and the child. Annie noticed him first. You're back, she said. I told you I would. The woman didn't move. Who are you? He stopped a respectful distance away. My name is... He paused, then gave it simply, without title. I met your daughter a few days ago. I know, she said. She told me. Days. There was no accusation in her tone, but no trust either. I wanted to talk, he continued. With you, not just her. The woman studied his face, then nodded once. Say it. He didn't waste time. He explained who he was, briefly, what he did, why he'd stopped that day, why he'd come back. He did not promise miracles. He did not use the word opportunity. He spoke about space, tools, time, safety. When he finished, the woman was quiet for a long moment. You're saying you want my 6-year-old to work for you, she said finally. No, he replied immediately. I'm saying I don't want her to disappear. Annie looked between them, expression unreadable. My daughter's smart, the woman said. People say that all the time. Then they leave. I won't, he said. That's easy to say. He nodded. That's why I'm not asking for anything today. He handed her a folder. Inside were addresses, names, permits, schedules, everything transparent, everything verifiable. You decide, he said. Nothing happens unless you're there. Always. The woman flipped through the pages slowly. When she finished, she looked up at him again. What do you get out of this? He answered honestly. A chance to fix something I helped break. She exhaled, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. You rich people always talk like that. Sometimes, he said. It's still true. Annie tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. I want to see the place. Reported. Her mother looked down at her, searching her face. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders relax, just slightly. Okay, she said. We'll see. The warehouse was quiet when they arrived. Sunlight spilled in through the high windows, illuminating dust motes drifting slowly through the air. Annie stepped inside and stopped, her breath catching. It's empty, she said. For now, he replied. She walked the length of the room, her footsteps echoing. She touched the wall, the floor, the window frame, as if mapping it in her mind. This is big, she said. Yes. Her mother stood near the entrance, arms folded, eyes scanning every corner. And you're saying this is just for learning? Yes. No contracts, no cameras. None. Annie turned back to him. Can I bring my computer? He smiled. I was hoping you would. They set up a simple table near the window. Annie unpacked her salvaged parts with care, laying them out exactly as she always did. The tablet he'd given her came out next. Then the small monitor. Nothing flashy, nothing intimidating. He watched as she worked, the space already bending subtly around her presence. This wasn't a child being placed into an adult world. This was a world finally making room. Her mother sat nearby, silent, observant. After a while, she spoke. She does this for hours. I know, he said. You're not going to rush her? No. Or show her off? No. She nodded once, slowly. Then we'll try. That night, back in his office, he reviewed emails he'd been postponing. Legal concerns were escalating. Research wanted updates. PR wanted control. He ignored most of it. Instead, he wrote a single message to a small, carefully chosen group. We're starting something small. Quiet. No announcements. No metrics yet. If that makes you uncomfortable, this isn't for you. Responses trickled in. Some declined politely. Some asked questions. 3 said yes without hesitation. That was enough. Weeks passed. The lab remained invisible to the world. No press, no leaks. Just Annie, her mother, a growing collection of tools, and a few adults who had learned to listen more than they spoke. Annie's work evolved quickly. She began testing redundancies, intentionally creating failures to see what survived. She asked questions that forced uncomfortable answers. She didn't care about being impressive. She cared about being right. One afternoon, as she watched a simulation stabilize after multiple forced crashes, she looked up at him. It didn't stop, she said. He nodded. You designed it not to. She smiled then. Not wide, not loud, just enough. In that moment, he understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't about lifting Annie up. It was about holding the system accountable for why she'd been so low to begin with. And systems, he knew, did not forgive that easily. The first sign of resistance arrived quietly, not in the form of threats or headlines, but as a calendar invitation marked urgent, sent late one evening by someone he hadn't spoken to directly in years. The subject line was vague, alignment check, but the sender told him everything he needed to know. He didn't decline it. The meeting took place in a conference room that existed for one purpose only: to remind people where power lived. The walls were bare, the table long, the lighting unforgiving. 3 people sat waiting when he entered, all familiar faces, all carefully neutral. We've been hearing things, one of them began. About what? He asked, taking a seat. About a side project, another replied. An unregistered initiative, no metrics, no oversight. He folded his hands on the table. You're describing research. This isn't how research works, the first voice said. There are protocols, Unquote. There are habits, he corrected. Protocols are just habits we don't question anymore. Silence followed. Not disagreement, calculation. Is there a child involved? Someone asked. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he was unsure, but because the question itself revealed the fault line. Yes, he said finally. There is. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. A tightening of posture. A glance exchanged. The room recalibrated. That's a problem, the second voice said. For everyone. It's a problem for a system that can't explain itself without rules it refuses to examine, he replied. They leaned back, studying him now not as a colleague, but as a variable. We need to understand your end game, the first voice said. There isn't one, he said. That's the point. Another pause. Then, that's not acceptable. He smiled faintly. It never is. When the meeting ended, no one raised their voice. No ultimatums were issued. They didn't need to be. He understood how this worked. First came concern, then containment, then correction. The system always tried to heal itself. At the warehouse, Annie sensed the shift before anyone told her. She'd grown quieter, more focused. Her questions sharpened. She began testing boundaries she hadn't touched before. Pushing simulations past expected failure points, deliberately breaking things to see what survived. When something collapsed, she didn't get upset. She observed. Why does it stop here? She asked one afternoon, pointing to a point on the graph. Because that's where we told it to stop, one of the researchers replied. She frowned. Why? The man watched from across the room, saying nothing. Well, the researcher hesitated. Because going past that creates complications. Annie thought about that. For who? No one answered. Later, as the others packed up, she sat beside the man at the long work table, swinging her legs gently. People are nervous, she said. Yes. Is it because of me? He looked at her. It's because of what you show. She considered that. I don't show anything, I just work. He nodded. That's what scares them. Her mother noticed it too. The subtle changes. New faces appearing at the edges of the space. Questions phrased as concern. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. One evening, as Annie packed up, her mother spoke quietly. Are we in trouble? He answered just as quietly. Not yet. That's not comforting. I know, he said. But it's honest. She watched him for a long moment. You're still here. Yes, that matters. The pressure increased. Requests for documentation, inquiries about funding streams. A polite suggestion that perhaps the pilot should be paused until a framework could be agreed upon. Each message wrapped in professionalism, each one tightening the circle a little more. He refused to pause. Instead, he narrowed the group further. Fewer observers, fewer explanations. The work continued. Quieter than ever. Annie thrived in the silence. One afternoon, she called him over, excitement flickering briefly across her otherwise composed face. Look, she said. On the screen was a model simple in appearance, elegant in design. She had built redundancy into every layer, pathways that rerouted automatically when stress was applied. He watched as she triggered multiple failures at once. The system adjusted, slowed, but did not stop. You did this without optimizing for speed, he said. She shrugged. Speed breaks things. The words landed like a verdict. That night, the call came. Not an invitation. Not a suggestion. A directive. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When the voice on the other end finished, he said only, No. There was a sharp intake of breath. You're making a mistake. No, he replied. I'm making a choice. The line went dead. He stood alone in his office long after the city lights dimmed. The weight of the moment pressing in. He knew what would follow. Reviews. Committees. Pressure disguised as process. And through it all, Annie working quietly, unaware of the machinery beginning to turn around her. He drove to the warehouse late that night, letting himself in without turning on the overhead lights. He sat at the work table, running his hand over the scarred surface, thinking, for the first time, doubt crept in, not about Annie, never that but about himself. About whether conviction was enough, about whether standing still could ever be protection. He thought of her question, asked days ago, almost casually. Will there be more? Yes, he had said. Now he understood the cost of that promise. The system was watching, and it had begun to push back. The review committee convened without him. He found out the way people always did through an email forwarded one time too many, its original intent stripped bare by accident. No agenda attached. No invitation extended. Just a quiet notice that something was being discussed somewhere else. Containment, he thought. The second phase. He didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Years of navigating institutional behavior had taught him patience. Systems revealed their weaknesses when they believed they were unobserved. At the warehouse, Annie noticed the changes in a different way. Why are there new rules? She asked one afternoon, staring at a printed sheet taped to the wall near the entrance. They were small rules. Reasonable ones. Sign-in procedures. Equipment logs. Safety acknowledgments written in language far beyond a 6-year-old's comprehension. Because people are paying attention now, he said. She frowned. I didn't ask them to. I know. She looked back at her work, her fingers slowing slightly. He recognized the shift immediately. Annie was adapting not to the problem in front of her, but to the environment around it, allocating cognitive space to something that had nothing to do with creation. That bothered him more than the rules themselves. Her mother felt it too. They came by yesterday, she said quietly while Annie worked across the room. 2 men. Said they were from compliance. Hevaziu. What did they want? To make sure everything was appropriate. She hesitated. They asked a lot of questions about Annie. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Did they speak to her? No, she said. I didn't let them. Good. She studied him. This is getting bigger than you said. Yes, he admitted. And that's on me. She crossed her arms. I need to know you're not going to disappear when this gets uncomfortable. He met her gaze. If I disappear, it won't be by choice. That night, he received the formal notice. Subject: temporary suspension of unregistered activities. The language was neutral. Procedural. No accusations. No threats. Just a suggestion that operations be paused pending evaluation. He closed the message without replying. Instead, he drove to the warehouse. Annie was still there, sitting at the table, her feet dangling, her screen filled with diagrams layered over one another. She looked up when he entered, reading his expression with unsettling accuracy. They want you to stop, she said. Yes. Will you? He pulled out a chair and sat beside her. No, she nodded once. No smile. No relief. Just acknowledgement. Then we should finish this part, she said, pointing to the screen, before they make it harder. They worked late into the evening. The warehouse lit only by desk lamps and the soft glow of monitors. Annie explained her thinking as she went, not because she needed help, but because she believed understanding should be shared. If one part fails, she said, the others shouldn't panic. He smiled faintly. Neither should people. She glanced at him. People panic a lot. Yes, he said, especially when they think they're losing control. Near midnight, his phone buzzed. A call from a number he recognized immediately. He stepped outside to answer it. This is becoming a liability, the voice said without preamble. You're forcing a confrontation. I didn't choose it, he replied. You did. You're protecting a narrative, the voice continued. Not a child. He closed his eyes briefly. Those are the same thing. A sigh. You're outnumbered. Then you should be asking why. The call ended without resolution. When he returned inside, Annie was waiting. They sound mad, she said. They're afraid, he corrected. Of what? He considered the question. Of what happens if they're wrong? She thought about that, then returned to her screen. That's not very logical. No, he agreed. But it's very human. The next morning, the locks changed. Not physically, digitally. Access permissions revoked. Network credentials invalidated. A soft shutdown executed from afar. He stood in the warehouse doorway, staring at the unresponsive terminal. The silence suddenly louder than any alarm. Annie watched him carefully. Did they break it? No, he said. They think they did. He pulled out his phone and made one call. Plan B, he said when the line connected. Today, within hours, the space came alive again, not through official channels, but through people who understood how systems worked well enough to bypass them. Power restored. Local servers activated. The internet remained dark. But Annie didn't seem to mind. Less noise, she said. By afternoon, the committee's decision was no longer quiet. Emails flew. Meetings were scheduled. His name began appearing in sentences framed by concern. He ignored it all. Instead, he sat with Annie as she ran her latest model offline, isolated, resilient. When she initiated the final stress test, the system slowed, adjusted, and held. It stayed, she said softly. Yes, he replied. Because you designed it to. She leaned back, satisfied. They can't turn this off, she said. Not really. He looked at her, struck again by the difference between power and permanence. No, he said. They can't. But as the sun dipped low and the warehouse filled with long shadows, he knew the truth she hadn't yet learned. Systems didn't like what they couldn't control, and they always came back with more force. The subpoena arrived on a Tuesday morning, not delivered by hand, not announced with drama, just an email from legal, marked high priority. Its subject line carefully neutral, request for records. Attached was a document dense with language designed to sound reasonable while doing something else entirely. Demanding access. He read it once, then again. Slower. They weren't asking about Annie directly. Not yet. They were asking about funding structures, facility usage, data handling protocols, the scaffolding around the work, not the work itself. Classic. If they couldn't shut it down outright, they would drown it in process. He forwarded the document to the small group he trusted, then closed his laptop. There would be no frantic responses, no defensive scrambling. Panic was what the system expected. Panic created mistakes. At the warehouse, Annie was already working when he arrived. She had moved her station closer to the window, angling the table to catch the best light. The offline setup had changed her workflow in subtle ways. Without constant access to external references, she relied more heavily on internal logic, on memory, on intuition refined through repetition. She was building something new. What's different? He asked, setting his jacket aside. She didn't look up. I'm not assuming help anymore. He waited. When things fail, she continued, I used to think something would come fix it. Power, internet, people. She paused, then added, now I don't. That's a big shift, he said. She shrugged. It's safer. He felt the weight of that word settle between them. Her mother arrived shortly after, grocery bag in hand. She'd started bringing lunch for everyone, a quiet assertion of presence, of ownership. Today it was simple sandwiches, fruit, thermoses of coffee, but the act itself mattered. Someone came by again, she said softly as she set the bag down. This time they had paperwork. He nodded. I expected that. They asked about Annie's hours, about supervision. She's supervised, he said. By her own mind. Most days. Her mother didn't smile. That won't satisfy them. No, he agreed. It won't. By midday, the pressure became visible. A car parked across the street for too long, 2 people inside, pretending not to watch. Annie noticed immediately. They're not from here, she said. How can you tell? He asked. They don't look bored enough. He exhaled quietly. The watchers didn't approach. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was the message. We see you. Annie worked anyway. She had reached a point in her model where trade-offs were unavoidable. Efficiency versus resilience. Speed versus adaptability. Each decision required a sacrifice somewhere else. She chose resilience every time. Why not both? He asked at one point. She shook her head. That's how things break. People want everything to be fast and strong and cheap. It doesn't work. Some people make a lot of money pretending it does. She glanced at him. Do you? He smiled faintly. I used to. That afternoon, the email came. Subject: immediate compliance required. This one dispensed with subtlety. A deadline. A warning. Failure to cooperate would result in escalation. He read it once, then deleted it. Instead, he walked over to Annie and sat across from her. Do you trust me? He asked. She looked up, surprised by the question. She studied his face, the lines around his eyes. the tension he hadn't quite managed to hide. "Yes," she said after a moment, "but you look like you're about to do something difficult." He nodded. "I am." "What kind of difficult?" "The kind where people stop being polite." She considered that. "Will it stop me from working?" "Eventually they'll try." She thought about that, then closed her laptop gently. "Then we should save everything." My God. They spent the next hour backing up her work locally, redundantly, on devices that would never touch the company's network. He watched her organize files with care far beyond her years, labeling versions, documenting changes. "You do this like you've lost things before," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "Everyone here has." As evening fell, the watchers across the street were replaced by others. Different faces. Same posture. His phone rang. This time, he answered. "You're forcing our hand," the voice said. "No preamble now. No courtesy. You've had your hand on the lever the whole time," he replied. "This ends now." "No," he said. "This changes." A sharp laugh. "You think you can win this?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you're afraid to lose." Silence. "You're risking everything," the voice said at last. He looked through the window at Annie, who was methodically packing her bag. Her movements calm, unhurried. "Yes," he said. "I am." With scene, the call ended. Later, after Annie and her mother left, he stayed behind alone. He walked the length of the warehouse, touching the tables, the walls, the places where ideas had taken shape. He knew what came next. Audits, legal action, smears dressed up as concern. They would try to make him the story. He wouldn't let them make Annie collateral. That night, he drafted a message he'd hoped never to send. It wasn't addressed to the board, or to legal, or to the press. It was addressed to the public. Not yet sent, just written. Sometimes, he knew, the only way to protect something quiet was to make noise on its behalf. He saved the draft and turned off the lights. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a line had been crossed somewhere deep inside its machinery, and systems, once challenged openly, never pretended again. He sent the message just before dawn. No press release, no legal framing, no branding, just a short statement, posted from his personal account, written in plain language stripped of qualifiers and corporate polish. "I met a child whose work exposed a flaw in our systems. Instead of asking how we failed her, we asked how to contain her. I won't participate in that." That was it. No names, no accusations, no defenses. He set the phone down and watched the sky lighten through the warehouse windows, the city waking up unaware that something irreversible had already been set in motion. By 8 a.m., the calls began, first from legal, then from the board, then from people he hadn't heard from in years, their concern sharpened by the sudden realization that he had stepped outside the agreed-upon choreography. He didn't answer any of them. At 9, the first article appeared. It didn't mention Annie. It mentioned him. Tech CEO breaks ranks. Questions raised about oversight and judgment. Sources close to the company express concern. He read it once, then closed the browser. By 10, there were 3 more. The system had made its choice. If it couldn't silence the work, it would discredit the man standing beside it. At the warehouse, Annie arrived with her mother, unaware of the storm breaking just beyond the walls. Annie went straight to her table, pulling out her tablet, her notebook, the careful stack of drives she now carried everywhere. "You're early," he said. She shrugged. "I wanted more time." Her mother lingered near the door, phone in hand, scrolling. Her jaw tightened. "They're talking about you," she said quietly. "Yes." Not kindly. He nodded. That was expected. She looked at him, searching for something. "Is this going to end?" He considered the question. "Not today." Annie glanced up. "Why are people mad?" "Because I said something they didn't want said." She frowned. "Was it wrong?" "No." "Then why does it matter?" He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. That's a question some people spend their whole lives avoiding. The watchers returned before noon. This time they didn't bother pretending. 2 men stood across the street, talking openly into their phones, eyes fixed on the warehouse entrance. Annie noticed. "Of course, they're closer," she said. "Yes." She thought for a moment. "If they come in, I'll stop." He turned to her. No. If they come in, you keep working. She studied him. That's not safe. Neither is stopping, he said gently. Not for what you're building. She accepted that with a nod, then returned to her screen. Inside the company, the response accelerated. A formal letter arrived by courier just after lunch. Suspension of duties, temporary removal pending investigation. Language carefully neutral, as if careers were not being dismantled between the lines. He folded the letter and placed it in his bag without comment. At 2 p.m., his chief of staff called. They're forming a special committee, she said, voice tight. They want you to retract the statement. I won't. They say you're compromising the company. I'm clarifying it. A pause. They're going to make this personal. They already have. She hesitated. I'm sorry. For what? For believing they'd stop at pressure. He smiled faintly. Pressure is all systems know how to apply. By mid-afternoon, the warehouse door opened without warning. 2 people stepped inside. One from compliance, one from security. Annie froze. Her mother stood immediately, placing herself between them and the table. You can't be here, she said. We're conducting a welfare check. Compliance replied smoothly. Standard procedure. No, he said, stepping forward. This is a private space. They looked at him now, recognition sharpening their expressions. We have authority, security said. Not here, he replied. And not over her. Annie watched the exchange, her face unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I'm okay, she said. You don't need to check. Compliance blinked, clearly unprepared for that. We just want to make sure. She's safe, her mother said. I'm right here. Silence stretched. This wasn't the confrontation the system preferred. There were no raised voices, no visible wrongdoing, just a child who refused to perform vulnerability on command. Finally, compliance nodded. We'll be in touch. They left without another word. Annie exhaled slowly. They wanted me to stop. Yes, he said. They didn't ask about my work. No, he agreed. They never do. That evening, the message he'd sent reached a different audience. Emails arrived from engineers he'd never met, teachers, parents, people who recognized the pattern immediately because they'd lived inside it their whole lives. Thank you for saying it. I saw this happen to my son. They told us to wait. We're still waiting. He read every one. Late that night, after Annie and her mother had gone home, he sat alone at the work table, the warehouse quiet except for the hum of electricity. He opened the draft he'd written the night before and reread it. It wasn't enough. Not yet. The system was betting that he would tire. That public attention would fade. That fear would do what force could not. They underestimated something. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to protect. And protection, he knew now, required something the system feared more than defiance. Consistency. Tomorrow, there would be more articles, more pressure, more carefully worded threats. Tomorrow, Annie would come back and keep working. And somewhere between those two truths, the balance of power would begin to shift. The shift came from an unexpected direction. Not from the board, not from legal, not even from the press. It came from inside the company's own walls. He learned about it through a forwarded internal memo, sent quietly by someone who didn't sign their name. The subject line was innocuous. Internal discussion thread. But the contents told a different story. Engineers were talking, not publicly, not recklessly, but among themselves, in private channels the company had always treated as harmless outlets for technical debate. Someone had linked his statement. Someone else had asked a simple question beneath it. If this is true, how many others did we miss? That was all it took. The thread exploded not with outrage, but with stories. Small ones. Easy to ignore individually. Impossible to dismiss together. A junior developer whose algorithm had been shelved because it didn't fit roadmap priorities. Oh, a data analyst whose insights were credited to someone else with better presentation skills. A support engineer who had flagged a structural vulnerability years ago and been told it wasn't worth the cost to fix. Patterns emerged. Annie's work wasn't an anomaly. It was a mirror. By mid-morning, the thread had been locked by moderators. Too late. The idea had already spread. At the warehouse, Annie was deep into a new phase of her work. She'd begun mapping failure cascades, what happened not when one component failed, but when several did at once. Her diagrams grew more complex, but her focus sharpened. "This part assumes someone will intervene," she said, circling a section of the model. "That's not always true." "No," he said. "It isn't. So I removed it." He leaned closer. "What happens now?" She ran the simulation. The system slowed dramatically. Resources rerouted. Non-essential processes shut down. It wasn't graceful, but it endured. "It survives," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "At a cost." She nodded. "Everything costs something." Her mother watched from across the room, arms folded, her gaze flicking occasionally toward the windows. The watchers hadn't returned today, but their absence felt temporary rather than reassuring. "You should know," she said quietly to him. "People are asking about Annie. Neighbors, parents. They've seen the articles. What are they asking? If it's safe, if this is real, if you're going to leave." He felt the familiar weight of expectation press down on him. "What do you tell them?" She looked at Annie, then back at him. "I tell them what I see." "And what do you see?" She didn't answer immediately. "Someone standing in the open," she said finally. "That's rare." It was meant as reassurance, but it landed like a warning. That afternoon, the board made its move. The announcement came through official channels, its language smooth and practiced. A leadership transition. Temporary, of course, for the good of the company, to restore focus and stability. His name was still there, technically. Just moved. Shifted to the margins. Containment. Phase 3. He read the announcement on his phone while sitting at the long table beside Annie. She noticed the change in his posture immediately. "Did they decide something?" she asked. "Yes. About you?" "Yes." She closed her notebook. "Are you still allowed to be here?" He met her eyes. "Yes. For now." He smiled faintly. "For as long as it matters." She considered that, then reopened her notebook and continued working. The trust implicit in the gesture tightened something in his chest. Later, his chief of staff arrived unannounced. She looked tired, older somehow. "They're offering you a way back," she said without preamble. "A way back to what?" "To silence. To influence without visibility. They want you to say, this was a misunderstanding. And Annie? She wouldn't be mentioned." He shook his head. "That's the point." She studied him. "You know they'll take everything if you don't." "Yes," he said. "And they'll do it slowly, so no one notices. Is this worth it?" He glanced across the room at Annie, who was erasing and redrawing a section of her diagram, patient and precise. "She is," he said. That evening, the warehouse filled with a different kind of presence. People came quietly, one by one. Not reporters, not officials, engineers, teachers. A retired systems architect who'd spent 40 years watching good ideas die in committee. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't ask for permission. They just listened. Annie noticed them immediately. She glanced at him, uncertain. "They're here to learn," he said softly. "If you're okay with that." "To have?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "They can watch, not touch." That was enough. They stood along the walls, silent, respectful. Watching a 6-year-old work through problems most of them had spent careers circling without resolution. Watching her ask questions none of their frameworks had prepared them to answer. No one interrupted. When Annie finally looked up, she frowned slightly. "Why are there so many people?" He answered honestly. "Because you're showing them something they forgot." "What?" "How to see," he said. The room stayed quiet long after she returned to her work. That night, as the last of them left, one man lingered. Older. Weathered. He extended a hand. "I helped design the redundancy models for the power grid," he said. "We warned them about cascading failure. They didn't listen." Annie looked up. "Did it break?" The man smiled sadly. "Not yet," she nodded. "It will." He left without another word. Alone again, the man sat at the work table, exhaustion settling into his bones. He knew the cost was coming due. He could feel the system recalibrating, preparing its final response, but something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a private act of protection. It was becoming a shared recognition. a collective discomfort with the way things had always been done. Annie packed her bag, then paused. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No," he said. "Then neither should we." He smiled, tired but resolute. "Agreed." Outside, the city hummed, unaware that beneath its routines, something was beginning to shift, not loudly, not all at once, but with the quiet persistence of a system redesigned to endure. The first threat was subtle. It arrived disguised as concern, wrapped in the careful language of protection rather than punishment. A letter delivered to Annie's mother, stamped with official seals and phrased in neutral tones. It referenced welfare, oversight, best interests. Annie watched her mother read it at the kitchen table, her small hands folded in her lap, eyes tracking every shift in expression. "They want to talk to me," her mother said finally. "About what?" Annie asked. "About you," she replied. The man stood nearby, silent, already recognizing the tactic. When systems failed to control an idea directly, they went after the relationships that sustained it. "I'll go with you," he said. Her mother shook her head. "They asked me, not you." That mattered. It meant the system was narrowing its focus. At the warehouse later that day, Annie worked more quietly than usual. Her questions still came, but they were shorter now. Sharper, less exploratory, more defensive. "You changed this," he said, pointing to a section of her model. "Yes," she replied. "It assumed someone would protect it. And now? Now it protects itself." He nodded, though the parallel unsettled him. The meeting took place in a government building with low ceilings and harsh lighting. A woman sat across from Annie's mother, her smile practiced, her questions framed as reassurance. "We just want to make sure Annie isn't being exploited," she said. "Exploited how?" Annie's mother asked. "Children don't always understand when they're being used," the woman replied. Annie's mother leaned forward slightly. "My daughter understands when people don't listen." The woman blinked. "That's not what I meant, but it's what you're doing," Annie's mother said calmly. The meeting ended without resolution. No accusations, no conclusions, just a promise of follow-up. When they returned to the warehouse, Annie was waiting. "They think I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "Yes," the man replied. "They do. That's stupid." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes, stupidity wears authority." That night, the media shifted tone. The articles grew sharper. Anonymous sources questioned his judgment, his motives, his mental state. Words like obsession and recklessness appeared where innovation and conviction once had. Annie's mother saw one headline and closed the browser immediately. "They're trying to scare us," she said. "Are you scared?" Annie asked. Her mother considered the question carefully. "I'm careful." Annie nodded. "Me too." At the warehouse, the quiet gatherings grew larger. People came not just to observe, but to help. Someone brought better chairs. Another brought tools. No one asked for permission. It was becoming something else, and systems hated that. The injunction arrived 2 days later. A formal notice restricting access to the warehouse pending investigation. A legal freeze disguised as due process. He read it once, then folded it neatly. "They want us gone," Annie said. "Yes." "When?" "Soon." She looked around the space, taking in the tables, the wires, the diagrams taped to the walls. "Then we should finish." "Finish what?" She pointed to the center of her model. "The part that doesn't depend on this place." They worked through the night. No phones, no interruptions. Just the quiet hum of power and the scratch of pencils against paper. Annie documented everything, her handwriting careful, precise. She explained her thinking out loud, not for help, but for record. "If this fails," she said, "it fails here first." "That's good." "Why?" he asked. "Because then it doesn't fail where people can't see it." He understood. By morning, the model was complete. Not perfect, but resilient, transferable, alive. Annie leaned back, exhausted but satisfied. "It's done." "Yes," he said. "It is." Later that day, officials arrived at the warehouse. This time, they didn't hesitate at the door. "We're here to secure the premises," one of them said. Annie stood up. "We're leaving anyway." They froze, unprepared for compliance. Her mother took Annie's hand. The man gathered the drives, the notebooks, the work that mattered. As they walked out, Annie looked back once. They didn't break it, she said. No, he replied. They never could. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Not protesters, not supporters. Just people watching something unfamiliar unfold. As they passed, a woman called out, "Is it over?" Annie stopped and turned. "No," she said simply. "It's just not here anymore." They left the warehouse behind, its doors closing softly, already becoming a symbol rather than a place. That night, in a borrowed space, Annie unpacked her bag and set her work out again. Same careful order, same focus. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. Places change. Work doesn't. He sat nearby, the weight of exhaustion finally settling in. The system had taken the building, the access, the illusion of control, but it had failed to take the thing it feared most: continuity. Annie looked up from her work. "They're going to keep trying." "Yes," he said. She thought about that, then returned to her model. "Then, they'll keep failing." He watched her, a quiet certainty forming. The system could apply pressure. It could remove support. It could rewrite narratives, but it could not unsee what it had already revealed, and neither could he. The borrowed space was a church basement, not the kind with stained glass and polished pews, but one that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Its walls painted an indecisive beige. Folding tables lined one side of the room. A box fan hummed in the corner, pushing warm air in slow, determined circles. It was imperfect. Annie loved it immediately. "There are fewer echoes," she said, setting her notebook down. "Twelly well first." Her mother watched her carefully. Relief and tension braided together in her expression. The past week had taught her how quickly stability could evaporate, how easily attention could turn predatory. Yet here they were, still standing, still working, still choosing. He arrived last, carrying a cardboard box filled with cables, adapters, and the few tools that had survived the transition. He set it down quietly, letting Annie claim the space in her own way. "This won't be permanent," he said. Annie didn't look up. "Nothing is." That was new. He took a seat nearby, the hard folding chair reminding him how far he was from the offices and privileges that had once defined him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a steady reminder that the world he'd stepped away from hadn't stopped spinning. He didn't check it. Instead, he watched Annie reconstruct her work from memory, her hands moving with calm assurance. She redrew diagrams without hesitation, adjusting small details as she went, improving things she'd already decided were good enough. "You're changing it," he noted. "Yes," she said. "Now I know what breaks when people interfere." Her mother looked at him sharply. He met her gaze and nodded once. Annie was learning more than systems theory. She was learning the shape of power. That afternoon, the call he'd been expecting finally came. Not from the board, not from legal, from an old friend. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice said, weary rather than angry. "I don't see an easier version," he replied. "There is one," the voice insisted. "You step aside. Let this cool down. They'll fund something later. Maybe not for her, but..." "No," he said quietly. A pause. "You're burning bridges." "Yes. You won't get them back." "I know." The line went dead. By evening, the basement filled with familiar faces. The quiet supporters returned engineers, teachers, the retired architect. They brought food this time. Simple things. Soup in thermoses. Bread wrapped in foil. Community, forming without permission. Annie looked up from her work, puzzled. "Why are they here?" Her mother answered. "Because they don't want you to be alone." Annie considered that. "I'm not." "No," her mother agreed. "But they are." The man felt the truth of it settle in his chest. This had never been about him leading anything. It was about creating a place where others could stand without being pushed back into silence. As the evening wore on, someone turned on a radio softly in the corner. An old news program played. The voices steady, authoritative. Sources indicate the former CEO's actions may have crossed ethical boundaries. Annie frowned. "They keep saying former." "Yes," he said. "Are you?" He smiled faintly. Titles are easy to remove. 2 minus a vide. She thought about that. Is that why they use them so much? He laughed softly, then stopped. Yes, probably. Later, when the others had gone and Annie was packing up, her mother pulled him aside. They asked me again today, she said quietly. Who? Child Services. They want another meeting. His jaw tightened. Did they say why? They don't have to, she replied. They just need to say they're concerned. He nodded slowly. I won't let them take her. Her mother held his gaze. I know. But understand this, if they push hard enough, I'll have to make choices you don't like. I won't judge you for that, he said. Ever. She exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Good. That night, after Annie fell asleep on a folding chair with her notebook still open on her lap, he sat alone in the quiet basement, the radio now silent. He checked his phone at last. Dozens of messages, some hostile, some pleading, a few unexpected ones from people he'd never met. One message stood out. I saw what you did. They did this to my daughter too. Thank you for not pretending it's complicated. He stared at the words for a long time. The system had wanted to isolate him, to frame this as an anomaly, a rogue actor, a single story that could be corrected. It was failing, because stories, once shared, had a way of finding each other. In the early hours of the morning, he made another decision, this one quieter than the first statement, but no less consequential. He sent messages to a handful of people, journalists known not for speed, but for patience, for listening. No spin, no exclusives, just an offer. If you want to understand how systems fail the unseen, come listen. He put the phone away and looked over at Annie, her face relaxed in sleep, one hand still gripping her pencil. The system could question him, investigate him, strip him of every title he'd ever earned, but it could not undo what had already happened. A child had been seen, and once seen, she could never be unseen again. The journalists arrived separately. No cameras, no entourage. Just notebooks, worn backpacks, and the cautious posture of people who had learned the cost of asking the wrong questions too loudly. They took seats at the folding tables without being directed, glancing around the church basement as if trying to understand what kind of story lived in a place like this. Annie ignored them. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside a table, her notebook open, pencil moving steadily. The model had grown again, layers added, assumptions stripped away. She was working through a problem she hadn't explained yet, one that seemed to require long pauses followed by sudden bursts of clarity. She doesn't have to talk, he said quietly to the journalists. None of this depends on quotes. One of them nodded. We're here to listen. That was the right answer. They listened as he spoke, not with grand statements, but with specifics. How the project began, how it evolved, how resistance followed a familiar pattern once it became inconvenient. He spoke carefully, not to protect himself, but to avoid turning Annie into a symbol she hadn't asked to be. This isn't about a prodigy, he said. It's about what happens when someone doesn't fit the system's definition of acceptable. And Annie? One of them asked. He glanced at her. Annie is just honest about what she sees. As if summoned by her name, Annie looked up. Her eyes moved from face to face, assessing, measuring. They're writing about us, she said. Yes, he replied. Will they get it wrong? He didn't lie. Some of them will. She thought about that, then nodded. Okay, that was all. One journalist leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something? She asked Annie. Annie looked at her, then at him. It's your choice, he said. Annie shrugged. What? Why keep going? The journalist asked. With all of this happening, Annie stared at her notebook for a moment, then answered without looking up. Because stopping doesn't fix anything. The journalist didn't press. She wrote the sentence down exactly as it was said. By evening, the basement felt crowded not with bodies, but with attention. The kind that hummed just beneath the surface, waiting to escape into the world. Annie packed up her work methodically, unaffected by the shift. Her mother watched her closely. You tired? No, Annie said. Just done for today. They left together, Annie holding her notebook tight against her chest. The man stayed behind, speaking quietly with the journalists, clarifying timelines, correcting assumptions before they could harden into narrative. When the last one left, He locked the basement door and stood alone in the quiet. The story would break soon, not as a spectacle, but as a slow burn. The kind that didn't disappear after a day's outrage. He knew the system's next move would be swift and precise. He didn't have to wait long. The injunction escalated overnight. By morning, it was no longer about the warehouse. It was about him. Breach of fiduciary duty. Endangerment. Failure to disclose conflicts of interest. Each allegation carefully worded, technically defensible, morally hollow. His lawyer called before he'd finished his coffee. "They're moving fast," she said. "Faster than I expected. That means they're nervous. It means they're angry." He smiled faintly. "Same thing. They want you to disavow everything," she continued. "Publicly. Today. And if I don't, they'll file." He looked out the window at the city, the familiar skyline now feeling like a different country. "Then they'll file." He hung up and drove to the basement. Annie was already there, sitting with her mother at one of the tables. She looked up as he entered. "They're louder today," she said. "Yes. Owe. Does that mean it's working?" He considered the question. "It means they feel seen." She nodded, satisfied. Her mother pulled him aside. They called again. "I know. They're talking about removing Annie temporarily, until things stabilize." His chest tightened. "Did they say when?" "No," she said. "That's the point." He lowered his voice. "If it comes to that, if you decide to step back, I'll support you." She looked at him sharply. "You think I don't know that? I want you to hear it anyway." She exhaled slowly. "Good. Because they don't scare me. But I won't let her be a battleground. I wouldn't ask you to." Annie watched them from across the room, her expression thoughtful. When they returned, she spoke. "They want to separate us," she said. Her mother stiffened. "Annie." "It's okay," Annie continued. "I know what that means." "What does it mean?" he asked gently. "It means they can't fix the problem," she said. "So they're trying to move it." The simplicity of it struck him harder than any legal threat. That afternoon, the first long-form article went live. It wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel. It was accurate. It traced the pattern how systems elevated certain kinds of talent while dismissing others, how risk was framed as responsibility only when it came from the margins. Annie was mentioned only briefly, carefully anonymized. Her work described without embellishment. The focus was the response. The piece ended with a single question posed by an unnamed engineer. If this is how we treat what we don't understand, what else have we already lost? By nightfall, the article had spread beyond the usual circles. Comments multiplied. Messages poured in. Some supportive, some hostile, many frightened. Annie didn't read any of them. She sat at the table, sketching a new idea. "This one doesn't need permission," she said, tapping the page. He smiled. "Neither do you." She shook her head. "I still need protection." "Yes," he said quietly. "You do." And that was the truth no statement could soften. The system would not stop pushing. It would escalate until something broke him. Her mother, or the fragile space they'd carved out together. But something else was happening too. The system was being watched, not just by journalists or critics, but by people who recognized themselves in the pattern. People who had learned, the hard way, what it meant to be quietly erased. As he locked up the basement that night, he understood the next phase would be the hardest. Not resistance. Endurance. The injunction was filed at noon. By 1, it was public. By 2, it had a name. Former CEO faces legal action over unauthorized project involving minor. The headline spread fast, cleanly packaged for outrage and certainty. It framed the story the way systems always preferred. One man, one mistake, one boundary crossed. Simple. Contained. Wrong. He read it once on his phone while sitting alone in the church basement, then set the device face down on the table. Annie was at the far end of the room, working quietly, unaware of the precise moment the system decided to escalate from pressure to punishment. Her mother arrived 10 minutes later, her face pale but controlled. "They filed," she said. "Yes. They're asking for an emergency hearing." "Yes. They want a temporary order," she continued, voice steady through effort. "No contact, no access. They're saying Annie needs distance until this is resolved. When place, The room seemed to tighten around them. Annie looked up slowly. Distance from what? Her mother closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. From him, she said gently. From the work. From all of this. Annie didn't speak right away. She stood, walked over to the table, and placed her notebook down carefully, aligning it with the edge. She looked from her mother to him, then back again. They think this is about him, she said. Yes, he replied quietly. It's not, Annie said. Her mother knelt in front of her, hands on Annie's shoulders. Baby, listen to me. This doesn't mean you did anything wrong. I know, Annie said. They just don't know where the problem is. Her mother swallowed hard. He stood slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. This was the moment he'd prepared for, the one every instinct had warned him would come. He had told himself he was ready. He wasn't. I won't fight this in a way that hurts you, he said to Annie's mother. If the court orders separation, I'll comply. Annie turned to him sharply. Why? Because, he said, choosing each word carefully. Sometimes protecting something means stepping back. She stared at him, her jaw tightening. That's what they want. Yes, he agreed. But they don't get everything they want. Her mother stood. What do you mean? He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, thick, worn, its edges soft from use. This, he said, placing it on the table, is everything Annie has built. Every iteration, every explanation, every decision documented in her own words. Annie frowned. You said it was backed up. It is, he said. Everywhere that matters. Her mother understood before Annie did. Her eyes widened slightly. You're separating the work from the space, she said. And from me, he added, completely. Annie crossed her arms. They'll still try to take it. He shook his head. No. They'll try to dismiss it. She tilted her head. That's worse. Only if no one else sees it, he said. By late afternoon, the basement was full, not with journalists this time, but with witnesses. Engineers, academics, educators, a few lawyers who'd arrived quietly and stayed even quieter. He didn't address them as a group. He didn't need to. He invited Annie to speak if she wanted. She shook her head. They won't listen to me yet. When will they? Someone asked softly. When it costs them not to, she replied. Instead, he spoke not defensively, not angrily, but plainly. He explained the injunction, the allegations, the timeline. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for attention. This will be framed as misconduct, he said. That's intentional. It shifts the conversation away from what Annie built and onto who I am. ABS. And what do you want us to do? One woman asked. Nothing loud, he replied. Nothing reactionary. He gestured to Annie's work laid out on the table. Just understand this. Learn it. Share it with people who know what they're looking at. Annie watched them closely as they leaned in, reading her notes, tracing diagrams, asking careful questions she answered without hesitation. They weren't evaluating her. They were learning from her. That evening, the call came from his lawyer. They're pushing hard, she said. If you fight this publicly, it gets ugly fast. And if I don't, they'll still come for you, she replied. But slower. He looked across the room at Annie, now explaining redundancy to a professor who looked genuinely humbled. Then slower is fine, he said. He hung up and walked over to Annie. They're going to say we can't see each other for a while, he told her. She nodded. I know. It doesn't change anything that matters, he added. She considered that, then reached into her bag and handed him a folded page. What's this? He asked. My notes, she said. The part I didn't want to forget. He unfolded it. At the top, in careful block letters, she had written, Systems fail when they confuse control with stability. His throat tightened. You don't need me for this, she said. He looked at her, really looked at her, and understood something with painful clarity. She was right. He wasn't the center of this anymore. He had been the interruption, the catalyst, the inconvenience the system couldn't ignore. Now, he was becoming the distraction. That's good, he said softly. That's exactly how it should be. When they left the basement that night, they did so separately. Annie and her mother walked one way. He walked another. No cameras followed him. No applause marked the moment. just the quiet certainty that something irreversible had crossed a threshold. The system would get its separation. What it wouldn't get was silence. The hearing room was smaller than he expected. No grand bench, no flags. Just pale walls, fluorescent lights, and a long table scarred by years of quiet arguments that never made the news. The kind of room where decisions happened without drama and without witnesses. He sat alone on one side. Across the room, the system had representation. 2 attorneys, 1 social services liaison, a stack of documents arranged with careful precision, as if order itself were an argument. Annie was not there. That was the first thing he noticed, and the hardest thing to accept. The judge entered without ceremony. Everyone stood, everyone sat. "We're here to address a request for a temporary separation," the judge said, voice neutral, practiced. "Pending further review. Temporary." The word hovered in the air, elastic enough to stretch indefinitely. The system spoke first. They spoke about risk, about perception, about boundaries blurred and responsibilities misunderstood. They never raised their voices. They didn't need to. Their confidence came from repetition, from knowing these words had worked before. When it was his turn, he stood slowly. He did not defend himself. He did not explain Annie. Instead, he said one sentence. "This case is not about a man who crossed a line. It's about a system that panics when it can't draw one." Silence followed. Not agreement, not outrage, just silence. The judge studied him for a long moment, then looked down at the papers again. "The temporary order will stand," the judge said at last. "No contact, no collaboration, until further notice." He nodded once. He had expected this. What he had not expected was the relief that followed. Not relief for himself, but for Annie. The fight was no longer happening in the same room as her. Outside the courthouse, no reporters waited. The story had already been framed. There was nothing new to photograph. He walked to his car alone. Across the city, Annie sat at a kitchen table, her notebook open, her pencil tapping lightly against the page. Her mother watched her closely, searching for signs of fear, of confusion, of the quiet unraveling she'd been warned to expect. Instead, Annie was calm. "They said we can't see him," her mother said carefully. "Yes," Annie replied. "Are you okay?" Annie thought for a moment. "I miss him," she said, "but I'm not lost." Her mother felt tears threaten and turned away. Later that day, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a single notebook. Annie recognized it immediately. Her notes, copied by hand, every diagram redrawn, every margin comment preserved. At the back, one new page had been added, written in a familiar, restrained script. "You don't need permission to continue. You never did." Annie ran her fingers over the words, then closed the notebook gently. That evening, she began again. Not in the basement, not in the warehouse. At the kitchen table, under a flickering light, with the hum of the refrigerator in the background, she rebuilt her model piece by piece, adjusting it to account for something new. Absence. Across town, he sat in a quiet apartment he barely recognized as home anymore. The injunction had stripped away his calendar, his meetings, his endless motion. For the first time in decades, there was nothing scheduled. He stared at the wall, then picked up his phone. Messages had slowed. The outrage cycle had found a new target. The system had learned that spectacle without resolution exhausted itself quickly. That was fine. He wasn't done. He spent his days writing not statements, not defenses, but explanations. Clear, patient, unhurried. He sent them to people who asked thoughtful questions. He ignored everyone else. He did not mention Annie by name. He didn't need to. Her work had begun circulating, quietly passed from hand to hand, from mind to mind. Not as a headline, but as an idea that refused to stay put. At a university lab across the country, a professor paused mid-lecture, staring at a diagram sent anonymously. "This," she said slowly, "isn't how we teach this." A student leaned forward. "Should we?" The professor smiled. "Yes, we should." Days turned into weeks. The injunction remained. So did the work. Annie adapted quickly to the new reality. She built redundancy not just into her models, but into her process. She shared pieces with people her mother trusted. She learned how to explain without simplifying. how to protect ideas without hiding them. One afternoon, she looked up from her notebook. "They can't stop it," she said. Her mother looked over. "Stop what?" "People understanding," Annie replied. Back in his apartment, he received a message from his lawyer. "They're losing interest." Quietly, he smiled for the first time in days. That night, he dreamed of the warehouse not as it was, but as it could have been. Full of light, full of voices. Then the dream shifted, and the walls fell away, replaced by kitchens, classrooms, basements. Everywhere Annie's work had found a place. He woke before dawn with a certainty that felt almost like peace. Separation had not ended the story. It had clarified it. The system had taken proximity. What it hadn't taken and could never take was momentum. The first invitation arrived without ceremony. An email, forwarded quietly through 3 intermediaries, written by someone careful enough not to use names. "We'd like to discuss a model that's been circulating. Off the record. No cameras." He stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Yes." Listening only, the meeting took place in a borrowed conference room at a public university, the kind funded decades ago and maintained just enough to keep going. The walls were lined with outdated posters celebrating innovation. Their optimism faded but intact. 5 people waited when he arrived. Not executives, not officials. Engineers, researchers. One policy analyst with tired eyes and a notebook already half full. No one shook his hand. That, he realized, was progress. "We've been seeing versions of this," one of them said, sliding a printed diagram across the table. "It's not identical, but the logic is unmistakable." IF. He recognized Annie's structure immediately. The way failure was treated not as an exception, but as a condition. The refusal to assume rescue. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It showed up," the analyst replied. "No attribution, no explanation, just appeared." He nodded. "Then it's working." They spent hours talking not about him, not about the injunction, but about implications. Infrastructure, education, systems designed for collapse rather than prevention. "This challenges too many incentives," someone said. "Yes," he agreed. "That's why it survived." When the meeting ended, one of them lingered. "You know," she said quietly, "they can keep you sidelined, but they can't unteach what people are already learning." Across town, Annie sat on the floor of her living room. Papers spread around her like a constellation. She'd taped some to the wall now, connecting them with pieces of yarn scavenged from a craft kit. Her mother watched from the doorway. "You don't have to rush," she said gently. "I'm not," Annie replied. "I'm catching up." "To what?" "To where this goes without me," Annie said, tightening a knot. "I need to know it still works." Her phone buzzed a message from a teacher she'd met only once, introduced by a friend of her mother's. "Can I show your idea to my class? I won't use your name." Annie typed back slowly. "Yes, but tell them it's okay to change it." The response came almost immediately. "Thank you." At night, Annie dreamed differently now. No warehouses, no courtrooms, just systems folding and unfolding, some breaking, some adapting, all of them teaching her something in the process. In his apartment, he received another message, this one from his lawyer. "They're considering lifting the order." Quietly. No apology. No admission. He smiled to himself. That was fine. The injunction had done its job for them. It had slowed him down, isolated him, tried to starve the idea of oxygen. Instead, it had forced decentralization, exactly what Annie would have designed. The next article didn't mention him at all. It focused on a school district in another state where a teacher had restructured a computer science curriculum around failure-first design, citing an anonymous framework that encouraged students to plan for breakdown instead of success. Student engagement had doubled. Dropout rates fell. Administrators were confused. Annie read the article twice, then set the phone down. "They didn't ask," she said. Her mother smiled. "They learned." Annie went back to her notebook. Days later, the call finally came. Not from the system, from someone adjacent to it. "We want to make this official," the voice said carefully. "Not with you. With the work." He leaned back in his chair. "Official how?" "Protected," the voice replied. "Open. Unownable." He closed his eyes briefly. "That's not how things usually work." he said. No, the voice agreed. But usual isn't holding. When he told Annie through her mother, through careful channels that respected the order she didn't celebrate, she asked one question. Can they change it? No, her mother said. Not without everyone seeing. Annie nodded. Then it's okay. The injunction was lifted a week later. No statement, no acknowledgement, just a notice that the matter was resolved. He didn't rush to see her. He waited, because this time, it mattered who crossed the distance. Annie came to him. They met in a public library. Sunlight pouring through tall windows. People moving quietly between shelves. No secrecy. No guards. She walked up to the table where he sat and placed her notebook down between them. It kept going, she said. He smiled. Something deep and unguarded. I knew it would. She studied him for a moment. You look different. So do you. She nodded. I am. It widened. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind earned through shared struggle rather than proximity. After a while, Annie spoke again. They tried to stop it, she said. Yes. They couldn't. No. She leaned back, satisfied. Good. Outside, the world continued its endless noise, news cycles, arguments, declarations of progress and failure layered on top of one another. Inside the library, a 6-year-old girl closed her notebook, confident in the knowledge that what she had built no longer belonged to any one place, person, or permission. It belonged to everyone who needed it, and to the future that would demand it. The invitation came in the form of a keycard. Plain, unbranded, no logo, no slogan, no promise printed on the plastic. Just her name, Annie typed neatly in black, and beneath it, a single word, advisor. She turned it over in her hands, examining it the way she examined everything carefully, without rushing to meaning. What does it open? She asked. Doors, he said. Mostly the ones people usually close. They stood outside the building together, neither of them in a hurry to go in. It wasn't a tower. There were no glass walls or dramatic entrances, just a converted research facility near a public university, surrounded by trees that had been there long before anyone thought about innovation hubs or disruption. Inside, the space was quiet, not empty, quiet. Work tables spaced far enough apart to allow thinking. Whiteboards already marked with half-erased equations and questions left deliberately unanswered. Shelves of equipment, old and new, organized by function rather than prestige. Annie stepped forward first. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She walked in like someone returning to a place she had already imagined. This is different, she said. How? No one's watching, she replied. They're waiting. He smiled. That was the idea. People noticed her quickly, but not the way people used to. No gasps, no disbelief, no quiet calculations about optics or headlines. Just curiosity, respect. The kind that asked questions instead of offering conclusions. One of the researchers approached slowly, knelt to her level without condescension. We've been studying your framework, she said. We changed parts of it. Annie tilted her head. Did it break? No, the woman replied. It got better. Annie nodded, satisfied. That's allowed. In the weeks that followed, Annie settled into a rhythm that surprised no one who truly paid attention. Mornings spent sketching ideas on paper before touching a screen. Afternoons testing assumptions with people twice her age who had learned, finally, how to listen. She wasn't treated as a mascot. She wasn't shielded, but she was protected. When interviews were requested, they were declined. When offers came, they were filtered. Her mother remained present, always, not as a barrier, but as an anchor. And slowly, the noise faded. The system moved on, as systems always did, found other fires to contain, other stories to simplify, other people to elevate or erase. But something had changed beneath the surface. Curriculums shifted. Quietly, language changed. Words like resilience and redundancy appeared where efficiency once stood alone. Questions were asked earlier. Warnings taken more seriously. Not everywhere, but enough. One afternoon, Annie sat alone in the lab, legs tucked beneath her on a rolling chair, staring at a simulation looping on her screen. It wasn't failing. It wasn't succeeding either. It was holding. He watched from across the room, careful not to interrupt. After a long while, she spoke. They still think it's about control. Yes, he said. They think if they label it, they own it. Yes, she leaned back. They don't. No, he agreed. They never did. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. With the clarity that made adults uneasy. You didn't save me, she said. He smiled gently. I know. Rate Dine. You just didn't look away. That was the hardest part, he said. She considered that. It shouldn't be. No, he said softly. It shouldn't. That evening, as the lab emptied and the sun dipped low, Annie packed her things carefully. The keycard went into her pocket, the notebook into her bag. At the door, she paused. They'll try again, she said. Yes, maybe not to stop this, she added, but to take credit for it. He laughed quietly. That's almost worse. I have to us. She smiled a small, knowing smile. It won't work. Why not? Because this doesn't belong to them, she said. And it doesn't belong to you, he nodded. Exactly. Outside, the lights in the building flickered on one by one. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just practical, necessary. Annie walked down the steps, her mother waiting for her at the bottom. They spoke softly, about dinner, about homework, about ordinary things that mattered more than headlines ever could. He watched them go, a familiar quiet settling in his chest. Years from now, people would argue about when things changed. They would point to policies, to programs, to carefully footnoted papers. They would miss the truth entirely. Change had begun on a cracked sidewalk, with a child who refused to accept that broken meant worthless, with a system that panicked when it was finally seen, and with a choice simple, uncomfortable, and irreversible to stay and look. As he turned off the lab lights and locked the door behind him, he understood the final lesson Annie had taught him, without ever trying to. Justice was rarely loud, progress was rarely neat, and the most powerful thing you could do, in a world built on turning away, was to see and act as if what you saw mattered, because sometimes that was enough to change everything. The story reminds us that true justice and progress rarely arrive with noise or permission. Talent, dignity, and truth do not belong to systems, titles, or those in power. They exist quietly, often where society chooses not to look. The greatest moral failure is not making the wrong decision, but looking away when confronted with what is right. Sometimes, the most powerful act is simply to see what others ignore, to protect what is fragile, and to act with integrity even when the cost is high. Real change begins not with control, but with courage, attention, and the refusal to turn away. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.